Good afternoon. This is Emily Harmon. I'm the director of the Department of Navy's Office of Small Business Programs, and today I have Mr. Barry Plunkett as my guest. And he is the Assistant General Counsel for Acquisition Integrity. So can you explain a little bit about what that is and the role you play?
Sure, I can. So, and please call me Barry.
Okay.
That'll work. So I'm particularly grateful having this opportunity to address an audience, hopefully of a large size, because the Secretary considers this subject important enough that he has made industry outreach one of my performance objectives to the number. So I'm counting however many people come, and I'm getting credit for all of these anyway.
Can I share credit with you?
Yeah, sure you can. Sure you can.
Okay, good.
So 15 years ago, my office and my position didn't exist. And in late 2004, the Air Force got in trouble relating to an acquisition fraud matter. And naturally, the folks in the Navy said, well, what are we doing to make sure we don't get in the same position?
Okay.
And at that time, the suspending and debarring officials for the department was by statute, the Secretary of the Navy. He typically delegated it to the General Counsel, who in turn delegated it to one of his subordinates who had it as a secondary duty to what his primary purpose was. We had two other attorneys in the department who worked on procurement integrity matters, and they were called, that was the Procurement Integrity Office.
Okay.
So we looked around and we saw that the other military departments had much more robust acquisition integrity programs. And the Navy, as you know, does not like to be second to anybody.
No.
So we set up my position, the Assistant General Counsel for Acquisition Integrity, made that position the department's suspending and debarring official, and then put me in charge of the Acquisition Integrity Office, which has, in addition to myself, a dozen attorneys. And at the time, they set it up an embedded NCIS agent.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
So the purpose of that office was to serve as a central point in the department for matters relating to acquisition fraud, waste, other improprieties related to the acquisition process. And we were tasked to ensure that all of the remedies that come into play in matters relating to those things are coordinated and executed to the extent they need to be executed. So you have civil and criminal remedies that belongs to the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's Office, and we coordinate closely with them on matters that relate to the False Claims Act, whistleblower provisions under the False Claims Act. They ask us whether the government should intervene in some ways, and so we provide our opinion to make sure that those kinds of remedies are taken care of. But you also have contractual remedies. Those belong to the contracting officers. So we're in coordination with them to make certain that they take whatever appropriate contractual remedies they can implement. And then finally, there's administrative remedies, and those belong to me, and that's essentially suspension and debarment.
So are you really busy?
Well, we have we have a very robust program. So they keep statistics in the federal government as to how many of these actions have been initiated by each department. And the Department of the Navy is number 3 on the list. So we're pretty busy.
In the Department of Defense?
That's throughout the entire government.
Throughout the entire government.
Yep.
So how do you hear about these cases? How do the complaints come in?
Well, typically, we call them referrals. We'll get them from the Department of Justice in some instances when they have these key TAM cases, is what they call them. It's where a private citizen brings a lawsuit under the whistleblower provisions of the False Claims Act because they get a bounty if the government takes the case and they win. So we hear from them. We hear mostly from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS and DCIS. They have it's like an economic crimes division. And so when they open an investigation, they also notify us, and then we start tracking that even before there's a result. We get a lot of referrals from the inspectors general, typically DOD IG, but Navy IG, and also the system command IGs as well. And then we get referrals from contracting officers and from the acquisition commands. Typically those relate to poor performance rather than acquisition fraud.
Okay. Wow, that's pretty interesting. Well, just as a side note, I'm a little behind, but I've been watching NCIS.
Yes.
and they never have an acquisition fraud case on there. It's always a dead person or something
Right,
on the
it's
TV show. I guess
right.
it's not as exciting.
We always joke that most of the NCIS agents that we work with typically would rather be out kicking down doors somewhere than working with us, but it's an important job.
Okay. So what's the difference between suspension and debarment?
So suspension is a temporary exclusion from being able to get government contracts or to take advantage of federal assistance programs. And why is it temporary? Well, it's an indefinite period because either there's an investigation that's being conducted and we feel we have to take action before the investigation is completed because of some other reasons, and you have to have adequate evidence of those other reasons. Also, we would suspend a contractor, an individual, if they were indicted for a crime related to acquisition fraud or contract fraud, that kind of thing. So that person, they get suspended when they're indicted, and if they're acquitted, then they get taken off the list.
Okay.
If they're not acquitted, if they're convicted, they then get a notice of proposed debarment from me, which has the same effect as the suspension. They, again, still cannot get government contracts. They still cannot get federal assistance program benefits. But it gives them an opportunity to tell me why, notwithstanding the fact that they've been convicted, they shouldn't be debarred. And some folks come in with reasons that are good, some that are bad. At the end of that period, I then make a decision and either debar them or take them off the list.
So you said something about federal assistance benefits, that they don't get federal assistance benefits. So, I mean, how could that impact a person?
Well, what's interesting to me is that a lot of the debarments that we initiate are for individuals who've done something improper while they're employed by a government contractor. And typically they've already been terminated by their employer, and they figure what else could happen to me, so they're not going to be a government contractor, so they don't bother to respond. So then maybe a couple of months or maybe a couple of years pass, and then we hear from them because they have tried to apply for an FHA or VHA mortgage or a federal assisted student loan, something like that. So you're also excluded from those kinds of benefit programs.
Wow. So like if their child wanted to go to college or something like that, they wouldn't be able to get that.
That's right.
Okay. Christine, I'm sorry, but I can't find the page on my phone for some reason. Okay.
Mine's having the same issue.
Okay, we're having some issue where we're having trouble reading the questions. And so keep the questions coming in. Let us know that you're watching. And if you have questions, send them on in. So what are the kinds of things that might lead to a company being suspended or debarred? Okay,
so the Federal Acquisition Regulation in subpart 9.4 has all the causes, and specifically at 9.406-2 for debarment causes and 9.407-2 for suspension are actually exactly the same causes, just so you know. Anyway, so I mentioned one of them, indictment or conviction of a crime related to a government contract. So that could be fraud, embezzlement, false statements, bribery, kickbacks, any offense indicating a lack of business integrity or business honesty. That would be one type that would get you. There are also some other ones that perhaps are not as well understood because they're not directly related to acquisition fraud. And so those are the ones we talk about in the context of poor performance. So willful failure to perform a contract in accordance with the terms of the contract, that's a basis. If you have had a contract terminated for default, the contracting officers are supposed to tell my office when they've terminated one of their contractors for default, and then we look at that situation to see whether a debarment is appropriate.
Oh, okay. So, wow. All right, that's interesting. I didn't know that. So, well, can you give us some examples of things that have happened to companies that others can learn from? Because sometimes stories help people really hit this point home.
Well, they really they range from what I consider very serious to actually kind of ridiculous. So I'll go with the very serious ones first. So we had a situation where, and this was a large government contractor, but did a lot of business with small businesses who were subcontractors for them. And they wanted to get into an area of energy conservation contracts that were promoted by the Obama administration. But it was in an area that they did not have any experience. So they went outside the company, recruited an individual, and he had all the credentials you could possibly want and was actually very successful at getting the company into this new area of business. But they gave him too much authority and nobody was looking over his shoulder. So this individual would be the one who would solicit proposals for subcontracts. He would be the only one receiving the proposals, and he'd be the only one then selecting which company got the subcontract. And we discovered that one factor that played a very important role in his decision about who would get a contract is whether they would pay him some money to give them the contract. And he was actually very clever about the way he dealt with it. There were no direct payments to him. What he typically would do is he would have the company employ his son as a consultant, and the son, of course, wouldn't really do anything, but that was the basis for the payments to be made.
So I guess the lesson there is know who you're hiring and, always have some checks and balances in place.
Right. You don't want to have a single point of failure in a situation like that.
Yeah. How'd you find out about that? Did somebody?
Well, it was actually, again, because these were government contracts at the end of the day. One of the subcontractors knew the Navy contracting officer and, I think asked, gee, we thought we were the low bidder. And he said, well, no, you bid blah, blah, blah. And they said, no, we didn't.
Oh, wow.
So yeah,
Right.
you find out that way.
Yep.
So that was fairly serious. There were millions of dollars involved in kickbacks paid under that contract. And it took a couple of years to find out about it. So you have other types of situations where it's not a kickback problem or bribes, but are serious for other reasons. So typically Navy contracts will be very specific about the materials and processes are used in producing, ships or submarines or whatever, because of the possible consequences of failures of that equipment. And in this one contract we had for the system that made it possible to land helicopters on board our Aegis class destroyers, it's basically they sort of winch them down, and it's put into a tray that has to be made of a specific type of steel that's resistant to corrosion and the environment that's shipboard. And this particular contractor felt that a different grade of steel, which was also just turned out to be cheaper, would suffice. So we found out about that because the Navy doesn't just always accept the contractor's word that they provided what we ordered. We tested it and found it was the wrong grade.
But in that case, sounds like maybe the contractor was trying to provide something and they charge the same price, the higher price, and it was a fixed price. So they saved the money.
Yeah, it was more profit for them. And actually, that's one of the types of situations where you see improprieties. Is it's an effort to cut costs.
Right.
It's more than being a sharp businessman. It's being an unethical businessman.
No, yeah, we definitely want to cut costs, but not at the expense of people's lives.
Right. Right.
And there's reasons why we have specific requirements in our contract. And if you ever think that they're too stringent or something, let us know and ask us. But typically there's a reason.
Right. That's exactly right. There are areas of interest that each person in my job has, and so counterfeit parts or false certifications that certain materials have been used or tests have been run, anything that affects safety. Those are ones that we're going to take very seriously.
Oh, I bet. Wow.
So I mentioned also, though, that there were some that were kind of ridiculous.
Yes.
So in this instance, we had a company that was doing some maintenance work alongside the pier at the San Diego Naval Shipyard. Some of their workmen were working on the boat. Some were just doing, like barnacle scraping kinds of things. And they had porta potties for the workers on the pier, and it was a Friday, and one worker wanted to start the weekend early, and so he had an idea. He got a magic marker. He went into the porta potty, wrote on the inside "bomb," then left. And of course, the next person who comes in and sees that notifies base security, and the reaction was just, they evacuated the pier. police started swarming the areas. Dogs were sniffing for bombs. I mean, they really couldn't take any chances in a situation like that.
No.
So this is just basically a day laborer, but because it was something as significant as that, he ended up being charged with a crime, sentenced to 7 or 8 months in jail. And on top of that, he then gets a letter from me telling him that he's been debarred from government contracting. Now, okay.
Did he get his half day off though?
No, he did get off early he did. That was the good side of the story.
Oh, that's not very smart.
But you might ask also, okay, why would we bother debarring an individual who's not running a company and who's not likely to start a business in the future to do that? Well, we do that because some of our larger contractors check the system for award management list of exclusions to see whether a particular individual's name is on there as part of their hiring process.
Okay.
And so we do that.
Yeah.
That's why we do that.
Did you have another silly one?
I don't think I have too many
Okay.
other silly ones. I have ones where sometimes we think it's one thing and then it's another.
Okay.
So we had one situation, this also involved a small business, where the prime contractor noticed that the invoices had been changed. And so they asked the subcontractor about it. The subcontractor said, yeah, that was my bad employee, and I terminated him. And what we do in a situation like that, because we eventually get notified,
Mm-hmm.
is we'll send, and we think it's not, the problem was one rogue individual. We'll send a show cause letter, which basically says, hey, tell us about what happened and what you're going to do in the future or have done to ensure it doesn't happen again. And we thought we were going to get the usual kind of response. Well, I've done this, and I'm going to do that, and you tell me whatever else you want me to do. And instead, we get a very large package from a very big law firm, basically that told us, well, it wasn't really that other guy, it was the owner of the company.
Oh.
So that was a different kind of situation.
So you get lots of different situations. What are the ones that kind of happen more frequently than others?
Well, as I say, you get a lot of these instances where employees mischarge their time, where they'll come in early, come in late, leave early, and charge the time that's not worked to government contracts. And that builds up over a period of time till it's discovered. And so you can be talking about lots and lots of dollars. Those are typically part of mandatory disclosures that the large contractors are required to make when they discover one of these things. They have to tell the DOD Inspector General, who in turn tells us. But as I mentioned, the ones that I'm particularly interested in is less those kinds of things, because generally you're not talking about large dollars or significant consequences, but ones that, again, product substitution, counterfeit parts, certifying that a particular test has been run when it hasn't been. So we had one instance where there had to be certifications that particular process had been applied to this product. It was a metallurgical testing. And the certificates were there, but someone internal to the company noticed they'd been altered, and the head of their department responsible for doing these tests had been altering the certifications.
Wow.
And these were parts that were going to end up in submarines, and so something like that is just not going to be let slide.
Right.
And we take those kinds of things very seriously.
Well, we have within the Department of Defense that Management of Internal Controls program.
Right.
So it sounds like that's something that companies could implement in their office, which is some internal controls where at least you can't check everything, but you do some spot checks periodically in the biggest areas of risk.
Right. Now, small businesses are kind of at a disadvantage because they may not have the resources to really do the kinds of things that the larger contractors are doing. I mean, companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, all those companies, they have entire departments devoted just to ethics and compliance issues. And they have the resources and, of course, the commensurate with the risks, they have that as well. But there's still things that the smaller businesses can do. And we always say that the most important thing is for the leadership of the companies, whether it's the owner or the president, manager of the company, to make ethics one of his priorities and to make sure his employees know that, because you lead from the top.
Right.
And companies that do that much are going to be in better position to avoid these kinds of problems. And when something comes up, they're better positioned to deal with it.
So let's say you're the owner of a company and you are the one that notice, or you're an employee in the company, but let's start with the owner. You're an owner and you notice that something like that's happening, like the invoices are being altered and stuff, or time cards not being charged, right? What should you do? Should you just stop it and then not report it, or should you report it?
Well, you should definitely stop it. I would say that. But as part of that, you need to let us know as soon as possible.
Okay.
One of the things that, not every cause for debarment results in a debarment. We look at a list of mitigating factors and remedial measures. And one of the things that you look at is whether or not the individual or the company came forward without it being discovered by an inspector general or a contract officer or whatever. So the sooner that something like that is brought to our attention, the better it is for the company.
Okay. All right. Well, look, we've got I don't think we have any questions so far, but we've got people, we got someone from Toronto, Gary, we've got somebody from Eminent, Brandy, and then somebody from Michigan. Someone said, wow, that's crazy. I'm not sure which part of the conversation you were talking about. Yeah. And then someone said, processes are there, follow the rules and know the rules. And that's right. I mean, sometimes people, our government contracts have a ton of clauses in there, and I think sometimes they're not always read completely or not understood. So you got to read everything that's in your contract. And sometimes what's in the contract is not printed out completely, it's incorporated by reference.
Right.
So then you got to go to the FAR and look it up, or the regulation.
Right.
So let's see. So are there any new trends in suspension and debarment?
Well, the one that I think perhaps the small business community should know about is cybersecurity.
Mm-hmm.
So that has become a big issue and area of concern for the department, not just Navy, but DoD as well. And while the larger contractors, again, having the resources to protect the data to the state of the art, and so they're probably in a good position to make certain that the data we entrust to them is not compromised. It's often the second and third tier companies that, again, smaller businesses in many instances, who don't have the resources and perhaps don't know that have the techniques to put in place these procedures that really are needed. We have not classified information. I'm not talking about that, but we have controlled unclassified information, and so it's basically pieces of data that by themselves individually they're not particularly sensitive, but when you put them all together, they become important. And the folks that are engaging in these cyber crimes now, once they get in, they're able to look around and find everything they need, and they put it all together. So in going forward, whether or not a contractor has in place the kinds of procedures that are necessary to protect the data we entrust them could very well become a part of the suspension and debarment realm. And it would be along the lines of can the department trust a particular contractor, not just to have the technical abilities and the financial resources to do the job, but also procedures and infrastructure in place to protect our data.
Right. So I know the cyber regulations is something that we've talked a lot about with small businesses, and sometimes they'll say, well, it's kind of expensive to implement, but it's also expensive when someone steals our information in another country and ends up with planes that look like ours and stuff like that. So that's expensive too, and we can't afford that. So when you sign a contract, you've got the NIST standards in there, and you're signing the contract that's saying that you're going to comply with those standards. So I think just like anything else, if you have done all you can or what you think you can to meet those standards, and then there's a cyber breach, report it. Don't try to hide it. Report it.
And just because there's been a compromise of data doesn't necessarily mean that your company is going to be debarred.
Right.
When I was talking with some folks from NCIS in the counterintelligence side, they're very interested in this. what they're looking at is, okay, was this a case where the bad guy was just so good that no procedures in place would have prevented it, or is it sloppy, negligence on the part of the contractor?
Okay. All right. That's good to know. So when's the right time to engage with your office, and how do they find out about your office? I think it's through that website, which we did post on the flyer.
Right. Well, if you Google it, you can Google my office.
Google it,
You
you'll
find
find
it that way as well.
And you're right down the hall, right next door to our office
That's right.
at the Navy Yard.
We're in the Navy Yard.
So, but when should they, when a company becomes aware of it, even if it's potential, if you're not really sure if it's non-compliance or something, they can call and ask you or talk to you?
Well, what would happen is if they're not certain, okay, and they want to try and get some information. Now, I may not have the answer to whether or not what they're doing is a problem or not, but I can point them in the right direction so they can get the information they need. And I've done that any number of times in the past.
Okay.
And yeah, if you think you have a problem, as I said earlier, it's best to come forward as fast as possible, because I think I've said that these kinds of things are like fish. It's better fresh.
Right. Definitely. So we also have a big one. It's the Glen Marine.
Oh, Glen Defense Marine.
Glen Defense Marine.
Asia, right.
Do you want to just give an overview of that one? That's a big one. Is that why we're number 3?
I have to say that particular case did generate a lot of administrative actions. I don't actually have the precise number in front of me right now, but there were a lot. And that was a situation where it was particularly unfortunate because there were both Navy officers and Navy civilian personnel that were complicit in the fraud that was going on. And I'm sure a number of people read about this in the paper, but it was a company, Glen Defense Marine Asia, that sold husbanding services to the Department of the Navy. And husbanding services are basically just taking care of the needs of the ship when it comes to dockside. So, food, fuel, patrol boats, those kinds of things. And so what Francis Leonard was doing, Francis Leonard Glenn, I guess, Fat Leonard was his nickname. He would apply the supply corps officers or the other Navy folks that he thought were in a position to help him out with various things, bribes, gifts, prostitutes, any number of improper gifts, and they would look the other way when he overcharged for things or charged for things that had never been delivered. He was also able to get information about when a particular ship was coming in, because that's not information typically that the Navy gives out.
Yeah, all right.
He was able to influence
what port they pulled into.
Exactly, because there was ports that he had facilities at that the other companies did not, and so there was an investigation going on with this for a long time. But when it came out, any number of not just private folks associated with that company, but also government personnel as well.
And so then within our procedures, in our management of internal control procedures, we've done some changes to help us try to catch something like that sooner.
The Naval Supply Systems Command does the contracting for husbanding services. And they did a red team study following this and put in place a lot of different procedures to try and ensure that doesn't happen. Now, my office got involved because all these folks were indicted. They were all out of the I think the Southern District of California. I think that's where they were. And so when they're indicted, right away we suspend them. They get a notice of suspension from us. We wait while the proceedings are going on. They get convicted. They then get a notice of debarment from us. I don't think any of them replied. So after 30 days, or however long it takes us to put together the letter, they then get their notice of debarment. And there has to be at least 30 or 40 of those.
Wow. So I don't know if we have, there's a question. Okay, wait. If controlled unclassified information is published on FBO, is the bidder responsible to report it? Controlled unclassified information.
Well, if it's on FBO, first of all, I'm not
FedBizOpps.
Oh, okay. Well,
announcer.
If it's on FedBizOpps, first of all, I would say it probably is not really being treated as controlled unclassified information. But obviously the contractors are not responsible for that kind of a spillage.
Right. That would be the government
Right.
that's responsible for what we put out there.
Right.
But if you're concerned as a taxpayer or a citizen, let the contracting officer know or go
If
up
you
the
know,
chain of command.
yes, certainly if you know where the source of that information being on FedBiz Ops came from, yeah, you should let that organization know, because I'm not aware of any exceptions for that.
Right. We're not perfect. We could make a
Right.
mistake.
And
but-
it's happened before.
Yeah. So have you covered the topics that you felt like you wanted to cover? Because I can give a little commercial in between if you want, and then let people know. This is what I'll do. I'm going to give a in-between commercial and let you guys know that we're going to start wrapping up if you don't ask any more questions. And you can always read this, watch the video later, and send us questions if you have them. I wanted to point out just a couple of things. One is last week we had Mr. Jose Gonzalez from the Department of Defense's acquisition workforce come and participate with us. He's the executive director of DoD Human Capital Initiatives. And in that Facebook Live, we discussed the Department of Defense's acquisition public-private talent exchange. And you should go back and watch that video if you're interested in trying to get the inside scoop on how the government works, because with that acquisition public-private talent exchange, you could, as a small business or even a large business, have one of your employees come work for the government or inside the government for 3 months to 2 years. And so you still have to pay their salary, but it's a really great way of having somebody work with us and understand what we do. And then we could also send government employees. So we're trying to do that to encourage communication among government and contractors and to help with transparency. And the law says that 23% of the participants are supposed to be from small businesses, or 20%. And I know Mr. Gonzalez is really having a hard time getting small businesses to participate, and he wants to understand what the barriers are. So he has phone calls once a week, and you're welcome to dial in. I think they're Thursdays around 3. And in that video, he shares how to join in that phone call and let him know what the barriers are, so that he's going to have to go back and report to Congress how we did, how many companies participated, what the barriers were for small businesses to be participating. And we're going to try to knock down any barriers that are within our control. The other thing that I wanted to point out is a couple of upcoming events. The Department of Navy Office of Small Business Program participates in Navy Weeks, and we have some coming up, and they're advertised on our website and on our Facebook. But we have one May 30th in Oklahoma City, June 6th in Nashville, Tennessee, June 27th in Quad Cities, Iowa, and July 17th in Duluth, Minnesota. So that's a way of meeting with a small business professional from the Department of Navy and getting some questions asked. We also have the Department of Navy Gold Coast Small Business Procurement event that we put on with the National Defense Industrial Association, or NDIA, and that's in July in San Diego, the 24th through the 26th. A lot of senior leaders are coming to that. Secretary Gertz is coming. My replacement, Mr. Jimmy Smith, will be there. And typically about 1,800 people come to that event. This year is the 31st year that event's going on. And for anybody in the DC area tonight, I'll be at the Garden by Building Momentum, which is on Eisenhower Avenue in Alexandria. And that's at the Naval X organization's spot. And that's going to be called the Seaside Chat, Big Opportunities for Small Business. I'll be there. Our Small Business Innovation Research Director will be there, and so will the head of the Department of Navy's Rapid Innovation Fund. He'll be there as well. So that's a good opportunity to exchange information and to learn more and to do some networking. So I think we don't have any questions. Okay, good. So I know a lot of people, because we had one of these yesterday and now we're having one again today, and I know it takes time to take off of work, but I know that they do listen to these afterwards and watch them too. But are there any things that you want to say as we wrap up?
Well, let me. I think I may have, because I'm sort of jumping around in some of these.
That's okay. Yeah.
Things,
cover your points.
What I think probably would be helpful is to actually run through the process, how it worked on something that we did recently, and that involved a small business.
Okay,
so
great.
That might help.
Yeah. Definitely.
So we received a referral from a contracting officer with the Naval Supply Systems Command, and they had awarded purchase orders to this particular company, 10 different purchase orders. And there were still 20 others that were outstanding, but they had terminated for default all 10 of them because even though they had extended the delivery date, the contractor never made any deliveries.
Oh, wait, that's a small business?
That was a small business.
Okay, and I just have to say, we work really hard to get things set aside for small business. And when we put a contract in place and a small business gets it and doesn't deliver, that's not just bad news for that small business. That's bad news for the Department of the Navy for getting our mission done. And it's bad news for all small businesses because it can create an impression that small businesses are risky and they don't deliver. So we really try to do our market research up front to make sure we're not getting into a risky situation like that. But this kind of a situation impacts our small business professionals' credibility because we're out there getting involved early in the acquisition process and advocating for small business and saying that small businesses can do the work based on our market research. And when you don't deliver, not good.
And I would say that from my perspective, this is fairly an exceptional circumstance.
I hope so.
I do not see the majority of my actions
I'll get off my soapbox.
do not involve small businesses. But in this particular case, we looked into it and found the contractor had never delivered anything. And the only reason why it was referred to my office, because the education is one of the problems. Not all the contracting officers out in the field realize that they're supposed to refer these kinds of things to
Right.
us. So what finally prompted this particular contracting officer to complain to his attorney about it and look for something that they could do was that even though this contractor had never delivered, they kept proposing on future purchase orders, and they were almost always the low bidder. Now, the contracting officer by this time said, well, you're not responsible. I can't make an affirmative determination of responsibility. But as a small business, he had to refer it to the Small Business Administration to see if they could get a certificate of competency. Now, they SBA didn't give one of those out, but they had to keep doing it. And they did it 37 times in a row, and the company still kept proposing. So finally, it's referred to my office. You know, this was almost the poster child for a poor performance administrative action. So we sent out the notice of proposed debarment. The company goes on the exclusions list, and we give them 30 days to tell us why they shouldn't be debarred. And the company actually got an attorney, and we permit them to present matters in opposition, we call it. So they can either send us a package in writing, they can do that, and they can come in and talk to us about it. And so this company did both. And the excuse for the non-performance was basically that it wasn't their fault, it was their suppliers. And, you know, that's just not an adequate excuse. So, you know, that's a very extreme example.
Right.
We waited the period of time, and then we sent them a notice of debarment. So typically a debarment is for a period of 3 years. And this was not the type where we would do longer than that,
Right.
But at least 3 years.
So let me ask you a question though. When you went to the SBA issued a certificate of competency?
No,
They
I'm sorry.
didn't.
No,
They didn't.
They
Okay.
wouldn't, and that's what was frustrating the contracting officer was because he had done that. SBA had shown they weren't going to give a certificate of competency, and the company kept proposing anyway.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So he couldn't figure out any other way to deal with it.
Yeah.
And had he noticed us when the first termination was issued, we wouldn't have had to do all that.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I don't remember that your office when I was in contracting, but that was a long time ago, and your office didn't exist at the time.
No.
But the Procurement Integrity Office did. And I don't know if I would have remembered to call either, but we can help with that too. We can make sure our small business professionals know about notifying your office too.
Right. As I say, the whole process of suspension and debarment, these administrative remedies are set out in the Federal Acquisition Regulation at subpart 9.4. And at essence, what my office does is to make sure that the government only contracts with companies who are deserving of that trust and that responsibility. So responsibility is more than just having the technical resources. It's having that satisfactory record of integrity and business ethics.
Do you ever get involved in a case where, you know how when we do a small business set aside, the small business is required to do, you know, the 50%, 51%, that's that limitations
Right.
in subcontracting. Do you ever get cases where people are complaining that the company is just acting as a pass-through and not meeting that limitations on subcontracting?
I haven't seen, first, I've only been in the job for about a year,
Right.
so I haven't seen, everything that's out there. Certainly, if you had a situation where it was clear that a large business was willfully avoiding to contracting with a small business, not meeting its goals, that would be a problem.
So that's subcontracting, but if the small is a prime contractor and they're required, they have to do the 50%,
right.
and they're just like subbing it out to a large company, and the large company is doing all the work, but we're getting our small business credit.
Yeah, no, we have one, so that, not specific to that, but we had one in the office just recently where the company that was receiving the contract was an 8A company, but what was actually happening was that 8A company was being used as a pass-through.
That's what I mean.
And providing it to a company that had graduated from the 8A program and knew all the tricks, had done what they needed to do to help the prime contractor become certified in the 8A program, and basically they did nothing. They just passed it through.
That's not right.
So
Yep,
so
that's
that
not
company
right.
got debarred.
Good. And so make sure if you're a small business on a small business set aside and you got to meet that limitations on subcontracting, make sure that you're doing that and you're not acting as a pass-through. The purpose of the 8A program and the purpose of small business set asides is to let companies get that experience, and you're not getting that experience if you're just charging us a pass-through and having somebody else do the work. That's not right.
Right.
So,
And to your point as well, the other things that I've seen several times, are instances where a company has falsely certified that it's a small business.
right.
And then when that happens, they get debarred as well. So,
Right. I mean, sometimes people ask me, why doesn't the SBA just go verify that every company is a small business? But the SBA doesn't have enough employees to do that. So that's why we have self-certification in
Right.
many areas. We just can't police everything, but we're
And unfortunately, there's really not much, as you say, much we can do. Those kind of situations are usually something brought to our attention by the Department of Justice in connection with a prosecution against one of these companies or individuals.
Okay. Anything else that you want to cover? We have plenty of time.
Well, I just want to make clear that my office is not out there hunting for people. We're not looking to take action against any particular companies. Companies that operate ethically and perform their contracts in accordance with the terms have nothing to fear from us. Now, there have been a couple of instances where, and I believe it was a small business, generally did not know what the requirements were, because I think it may have been a situation, like you said, where they either didn't read the clause because it was just a reference, or it was one of those government clauses which are not crystal clear, and we have a few of those.
Right.
And they operated on the assumption that one interpretation was correct, and it wasn't. Now, in a situation like that, where it's clear to me anyway that the non-compliance was an honest mistake, they have nothing to fear from me.
Okay.
And so it's those situations where you go beyond being a sharp businessman to trying to pull one over on the government.
Right.
Those are the ones that are getting in trouble.
Right. Definitely. Okay. Let's see. No questions. So I think we're done, right? So thank you, everybody. This is my last Facebook Live as Director of the Department of Navy's Office of Small Business Programs. I've really enjoyed working with you all. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, feel free to do that. And Barry, thank you very much for coming on
My pleasure.
our show.
My pleasure, yes.
Okay.